The 1868 election promised to be a fascinating one. Just 3 years removed from the assassination of Lincoln, it was the first presidential election of the Reconstruction era, the first time that emancipated former slaves could vote in the South. In this election, we see the Republican candidate, former commander of the US Army, Ulysses Sam Grant, up against former governor of New York, Horatio Seymour, representing the Democrat Party. Before we go any further, I want to point your attention to the 3 states highlighted in green on the map. They are Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia. And the reason they're highlighted in green is that those states did not participate in the 1868 election because they hadn't yet been restored to the Union. I'm going to talk first about the incumbent party of the presidency, the Republican Party, and their nominating convention. As you can see, President Johnson, post-impeachment, things have turned very sour for him and his relationship with the Republicans. They chose Ulysses Sam Grant, a national hero of the Civil War, who was unanimously chosen on the first ballot when it was held in Chicago, Illinois, in May of 1868. The radical Republicans had their selection at Vice President. Julia Colfax, Speaker of the House of Representatives, representing the state of Indiana, was able to win the nomination on the 6th ballot, and he beat out a fellow radical, Benjamin Wade, to the nomination. And so what the Republicans believed is that they had a war hero that could win votes across the North from Democrats and Republicans, but also a radical on the platform to stay true to the radical Republican agenda. And the Republican platform was very much as expected when we look at radical Reconstruction. They were supportive of black suffrage in the South as a pathway to full citizenship. Interestingly enough, northern states would be allowed to decide for themselves individually whether or not they would give blacks in their state the right to vote. But for the Republicans, it was very much a case of continuing with the normality that they had tried to set up in the later years of the Johnson administration. And their national convention took place and passed without much controversy at all. We can't say that for what happened with the Democrats. As I said, the Democratic National Convention, held just 6 weeks after the Republicans, was far more contentious than it was in the Republican Party. There were about 12 candidates in the running, including the incumbent President Andrew Johnson, who of course was a Democrat from the state of Tennessee before he was elected on the National Union ticket in 1864. But he wasn't ever really in the running. In the first ballot at the convention, he only gets 65 votes, and he's never really a candidate that stands a chance in the race. And very early on it becomes clear that the spectre of impeachment was still hanging over him. The frontrunner of these 12 candidates for the first 15 ballots was George H. Pendleton. I'll put a little P there for Pendleton. He was the former member of the House of Representatives for the state of Ohio from 1857 to 65, and he was leading on the first 15 ballots. Second to him was Thomas A. Hendricks, the senator for Indiana. And he was a close second in the early stages. After the 15th ballot, Pendleton's support began to collapse. Hendricks was now battling it out with General Winfield Scott Hancock. He shares a name, but not a relation, to the Union Major General Winfield Scott at the start of the Civil War. And Winfield Scott Hancock himself was a Major General too. And for a while it looked like it would be a battle between Hendricks and Hancock. But then there was this ongoing situation with the convention chairman, Horatio Seymour. The North Carolina delegation at some point during proceedings tried to put forward his name on the ballot, and he refused, citing that convention rules wouldn't allow him to do so due to a conflict of interest. It happened again on the 22nd ballot, when the Ohio delegation did exactly the same thing, and again Seymour refused to acknowledge their attempt to nominate him for the presidential nomination. Now, the story goes that Seymour leaves the room to cool off, and when he does so, the convention unanimously selects him as the Democratic nominee for the presidency. Another unanimous nomination is Francis Preston Blair Jr., former member of the House of Representatives for the state of Missouri. He was unanimously appointed as the vice presidential nominee when all the other candidates for the position dropped out. It had been an exhausting process, and the ticket now was able to claim both a north-south and an east-west balance. We had the former governor of New York from the northeast, but then we also had a former member of the House for Missouri representing the south and west. And finally, the Democrats had their ticket. We'll talk now a little bit about the campaign. As was traditional for the presidential nominee, much like Lincoln did, Grant was hands-off during the campaign. The slogan of the Republican campaign was, "Let us have peace," which was what Grant said upon accepting the nomination. It should have been plain sailing for the Republicans with his status as a war hero, but his opponents managed to find a way to use his war record against him. They recalled General Order Number 11, which was declared by Grant during the Civil War. It was an anti-Semitic order. It expelled all the Jews from his military district in 1862. His district covered areas of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kansas. And the aim was to stop the illicit cotton trade. Grant believed that the trade was mostly run by Jews, and so decreed that all Jews be removed from his military district. In Holly Springs, Mississippi, Jews were rounded up and forced out of town. 30 Jewish families were expelled from Paducah, Kentucky. And this was used to show that Ulysses Sam Grant wasn't the unifier many people had made him out to be. And the Democrats took great delight in pointing out that President Lincoln overturned this ruling in 1864. But the Republicans were also able to attack Seymour. They accused him of lacking enthusiasm for the war effort, for the few New York men who were sent to fight at Gettysburg. And again, during a negative campaign, these claims became easily and readily exaggerated. He was accused of calling the 1863 draft rioters "my friends." The Republicans even went as far as to cite the suicide of his father to suggest that insanity ran in the family. The Democrat campaign saw Blair on the campaign trail, and Preston Blair Jr. was known for his contentious and controversial comments. And at one appearance, he told the audience that black polygamists wished to subject white women to their unbridled lust. Now, the Democratic campaign knew that this wasn't going to be a vote-winning message in the North, and so after that limited his campaign appearances to Missouri and Illinois, where his message might be slightly better received. And the 1868 election result was shocking for the Republicans in that it was closer than they expected. If we look at the Electoral College, it seems like an overwhelming victory for Grant and the Republicans, but it doesn't tell the whole story. If we look at the popular vote, the margin of victory was just 6%. 300,000 votes was the difference. The Electoral College looked better. Grant had 73% of Electoral College votes. The Democrats won only 8 states: Delaware, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, New Jersey, New York and Oregon. But the result was surprisingly close. There were narrow margins of victory in Indiana, Connecticut and Pennsylvania for the Republicans. And the effect of the black vote in the South, victories in Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee and Arkansas, those Republican wins were put down to the increased black vote in the South. And it led many to speculate that when it came down to white men, Seymour was the winner. Interesting that for every southern state that contested the election, the Republicans carried every single one, with the exception of Louisiana and Georgia. And the Ku Klux Klan was particularly effective in its work intimidating voters in trying to ensure a Democratic victory. But it was clear in the South that to have freed African Americans at the ballot box, able to vote, this is the highest concentration of the black population. Politics was changing, and the Republicans were starting to win states in the South like never before. Interestingly enough, in the border states, we see victories for the Democrats in Kentucky, Maryland and Delaware, which were all solidly Democrat. Missouri and West Virginia, however, went for Grant. I want to talk about New York for just a moment, because it was a hugely significant state in terms of its electoral college votes, 33, the highest number of any of the states contesting the election. Seymour won by 10,000 votes. The Republicans were perplexed that they had managed to lose this election and called a federal investigation into the result. And a committee of 7 was selected, 5 Republicans, 2 Democrats from Congress, to report back on any evidence of electoral fraud. On February the 23rd, 1869, the committee found that no action was needed, and Seymour kept New York's 33 electoral college votes. Not that it did him any good. The 2 states with the closest result were on the West Coast. Oregon, worth only 3 electoral college votes, was won by 164 votes total. In California, the Republicans won by 520 votes total, less than 0.5% of the total voting population. Again, though, these 2 states are worth just 8 electoral college votes and wouldn't have factored into the result. And it seems here that the electoral college, which from the signing of the Constitution seemed to support the Democrats in the South for so long, was now upholding the Republicans in power.